And I'm going to go right into sharing screen. And I'll clean this up a little bit. Get the right window going here. All right, so we've been talking about NavMesh. This is one of our AI tools. It allows our AIs to navigate on a landscape, and they follow the shortest distance between 2 points. And even if the target is moving, the AI can track it. We have the ability to put non-stationary obstacles in our way, doors that open and close. We'll see that in a minute. And the NAV mesh is relatively simple. The first step of using a NAV mesh is to generate the NAV mesh. And so we open the navigation window here. It's under AI navigation. It usually docks over here next to the inspector, and it looks like this. We have these 4 tabs. The agent, there's only the humanoid actually, unless you get the advanced package. There are the areas that are considered costs of traversing a particular part of the terrain, and we can make the terrain have different costs to navigate. We have this object tab that will select all the mesh renderers in the scene or all the terrains in the scene. There's no terrain here, so it doesn't select it, or you can just pick everything. And when we do this, we need to assign to our different objects whether they are nav mesh static or not. This cost of the path allows us to kind of define different areas that a character will favor. In its assessment of the shortest path, it takes into account the cost of traversing different terrains. So if you have an area that's very high cost, it will find a route around it that may be longer, but will avoid that high cost area. But it is still able to cross those regions, unless, of course, it's the built-in not walkable, which has an infinite cost, and it'll avoid it. And there are various different reasons why we would do this, depending on the nature of your game. We make things NavMesh static. Here's a little cube that is set to be NavMesh static, navigation static here. And so I can see that this has carved out an area around it that is not walkable. The character cannot go through this particular area. And so when my little character runs through here, it has to take this kind of snaky path in amongst all these different blocks as it navigates through that little S curve. If I take this curve, this object, and change it to be no longer NavMesh static, and I rebake the scene, you'll see that now the navigation mesh is continuous across here. And if we play this now, what we'll see is our little NavMesh agent will plow right through that particular obstacle. It pays no attention to it because its NavMesh continues underneath the object. So let's set that back to the way it was here. I want this to be navigation static, and I want to rebake my scene so that there's this nice little area around it. The bake tab has these different options. The radius determines how close a navigating character can get to a wall. That radius defines this kind of white area here, how big it is. You can make it smaller and it can get closer to the wall. You can make it larger and it'll stay further from the wall. We also have the height. And so I don't have a demonstration of this, but if we had some obstacle that was too low, a character would not be able to go underneath it if its height were too tall. And that's one of the settings that we have on our NavMesh agent. On our NavMesh agent, we get to specify its height. Not here. It's in the humanoid. It's in the bake settings here. We specify the agent's height. So this can go under anything with a clearance of 2 meters. And these are things that we can adjust. Other parameters of the bake include the maximum slope that a character can navigate. And so here in this scene, I have a slope of 45 degrees. And there's also the step height, how big a step the character will be able to navigate. And here's an interesting little warning here. It's telling me that the step height conflicts with the maximum slope. This makes some slopes unwalkable. And it says consider decreasing the maximum slope to 36.9 degrees or increasing the step height to 0.25. So if I increase the step height to 0.25, that little warning goes away, but I'll leave it alone here. It doesn't actually matter in this scene. Once we're all done, we just need to press the bake button. It's very quick. It's not like light map baking that takes a long time. And when we're done, the different colors of the NavMesh will indicate the different areas that we have here in our scene. So once the NavMesh is set up, then we need to equip our characters. And this means that we add to them a NavMesh agent component. So here's our NavMesh agent that we got from one of the components here under navigation, NavMesh agent. So this added this to it. It has the agent type, which is always humanoid. And importantly is this base offset. In order for this little cylinder that is around my character to match the base of the object that I want to navigate on the surface, I had to move that base offset to 0.5 in order for it to match. And so this is one of the fiddles you have to do to make sure that the feet of your character, the base of your character, matches the base of the NavMesh agent. Other settings include the radius and height. That's the cylinder that surrounds this little thing here. It's a cylinder that surrounds my character, and it has a radius, how wide the cylinder is, and a height, how tall the cylinder is. And this is what plays into that NavMesh avoidance property. The radius is kind of the smallest gap that the thing can get through. Our objects, our agents have to have speed, acceleration, and angular speed. Speed is how fast the character is going to go when it traverses the NavMesh. Angular speed is how rapidly it's able to turn, and acceleration is how quickly it gets up to speed and how quickly it turns. And so here I have a speed of 10, an angular speed of 120 degrees per second, and an acceleration of 8, which is how fast it gets going to its target. So I can play this thing, and it's going to navigate along this ramp system that I've got set up, if it ever gets started here. My Unity might be crashing here, I'm not sure. There we go. No? Okay, it's finally running. I don't know why it's taken so long. Interestingly, when the gizmo's on, you can kind of see what this thing is using to think. It's got that little pattern of stuff out in front of it. This is where it's probing the world in front of it to see where it's trying to go. And it heads up the hill here, and it has this target ahead of it that is the destination of my little character. And that destination here was just set in a simple script. Well, I'll show you the script in a minute. Now, there's an issue with stopping, and here's an example scene. Save that. Here's a little example scene where I've got my obstacle set out here, some distance in front of, no, I have my destination set out here some distance in front of my player. And in the inspector for my NavMesh agent, I have a stopping distance of 0, and then the auto braking is turned off. And what we're going to see happen here is what's called orbiting. The NavMesh agent is trying to get within a distance of 0 of its target, and it doesn't slow down. I don't know why it's taking so long to start here. Unity and Zoom don't always play well together. So it overshoots. It goes beyond the target, and then it comes back, and it overshoots again, and it overshoots again. And it just can't ever get to the target because its acceleration and its speed and its turning speed are too high for it to obtain that target. And the fix for this is to set the auto braking on, and give it some finite stopping. We'll guess 5 to see if that works. And so now it's going to satisfy its arrival at the target if it's within a distance of 5 of it, and it's going to automatically begin to brake as it gets close enough to that target. And again, this thing is taking forever to go. Boy, that's terrible. So there it satisfied and came to rest. And if I set this up a little bit higher, maybe to a stopping distance of 10, it'll now come to rest in front of the target. And while we wait for Unity to figure out what it's doing here, God, this is terrible. So now at a distance of 10, it began to auto brake. And so it came to rest, not right on top of it, but within 10 units of it. So this stopping distance takes care of this endless orbiting that you get around a target point where the agent never fully reaches its destination. As an agent moves around, it'll avoid the static objects that have been part of the baked scene, but we also have obstacles that we can place in the world. And here's a nav mesh. Let me get in the correct scene here with obstacles. I'll save that. So here now I have an obstacle. And if I look at the navigation mesh for this obstacle has carved out a region around it. This obstacle is not NavMesh static. It's not NavMesh static. You can't actually set something NavMesh static if you're going to move it. NavMesh static things have to be just exactly what it says, static. They can't move because they're part of that baked scene. But these NavMesh obstacles can move, and they can move under script control. And when they do move, their carved out region of the NavMesh moves with them. And so this little obstacle has a little script on it, the mover that moves this thing back and forth. And there's another one partway up the hill here. And so if I watch that little region here, and of course it's going to take 10 minutes to get going again. So as it moves under script control, it's opening and closing these gaps, and the little agent is adapting to this, and it's finally able to get through the gap and make its way on to the target that's up the hill here someplace, and it'll hopefully stop when it gets to the target. And so there we have that. So these NavMesh obstacles can make dynamic elements of our NavMesh that open and close doors and do various things. Now, when we define an obstacle, we need to set the carve property on. Carve means that it's going to open up a space around it. We also have a carve only if stationary, and this would mean that it would not affect the nav mesh while it was moving. It would only affect the nav mesh while it was stationary. So a door that was shut and then opened might have the carve only on stationary, and then it would only carve out when the door was in a fixed position, either open or closed. And we also have settings here for the radius and height of the region that it carves out of the nav mesh. So same as the radius and height of our little player. There's one other feature of the NavMesh agent is its avoidance priority. And this determines how an agent interacts with another agent. We might populate our world with a lot of different agents who are moving around, and these agents are actually aware of each other. And so an agent with a with a higher priority number will avoid one with a lower priority. That's kind of backwards from the way I'd think of it. But this avoidance priority determines how agents interact with each other. And so if we have a crowd of agents, some can be higher priority than others, and they kind of have right of way whereas ones with a lower priority would avoid them, and the number is backwards. So we have to assign targets to our AIs, our agents, and we do this with scripting. So a very simple script here, the Pathfinder script, has a game object that is the destination that we want to set for our player. And in start here, I'm doing a get component of the NavMesh agent. I'm caching a copy of the NavMesh agent into the variable agent. And then I'm setting its destination to be the game object dest's transform position. Destinations are vector-3 positions in world space. You can, of course, specify it with a new vector-3 that tells it a position, but we often go to objects in our world, and this is the way one would do this. If we wanted it to target a moving destination, if our target object was a character that was moving around, we would want to have an update function that every frame reset the player's or the agent's destination to be the transform position of the player or target that we're having it chase. So this target point is a vector-3 point in world space. And if that vector-3 point is not on a nav mesh, it will go to the closest point it can get to it. And so the target doesn't actually have to be on the nav mesh. It'll go as close as it can get to it and stay on the nav mesh. The kinds of things that we'll do with these targets, we can have an NPC follow the player. We can send a character to a particular target marked by some game object, so an exit from the building or a location of a treasure. Or we can do this by clicking on the map with a mouse. And I think this is where I left off last time here. I had this little click routine. I better save it. I had this little click routine where I have one camera that's following my player around and another one that has a click to move script on it. And so this is something that I would put on my camera. It has an exposed variable for the camera, that way the object doesn't actually have to be on the camera. I have my cached NavMesh agent, so I'm not get componenting it all the time. And in the update, I'm gonna, whenever I press the left mouse button, I'm going to cast a ray from the camera's point to the mouse position, and the object that I hit with that ray cast is, I'm going to set the destination to that hit point. And so that's how this little scene works. I've got a little character here, the little blue square, and I have a nav mesh with these various static obstacles, and with the two dynamic nav mesh agents, our NavMesh obstacles that are carving a little bit out of here. You can only see the NavMesh if the gizmos are on. But here, if I click over here, it goes to this point. If I click over here, it navigates through the gap there and gets across, and it's dynamically updating the path all the time as it's trying to figure out a way to get through this opening and shutting door. I want to show you this on another scene here. Click on terrain. And here I've I've made a terrain that has a bunch of bumps on it. I used the terrain toolkit to generate this, and it's a fairly small terrain. And at this point, I've set the maximum slope to be 30 and baked it. And I can now see the nav mesh here that it has set up. And because the slope is so low, all of these steeper regions around here are not walkable. The nav mesh can't navigate it. I have my little character set someplace here on a nav mesh for an agent must start on a nav mesh. And I'm going to run this, and my little agent here, if I click over here, it's navigating as close as it can get to it. It's going to this point right here, which is as close as it can get to this, but these nav meshes aren't connected. And this one is. It's going to find its way through this little narrow region here and navigate around through these little crevasses and cracks to get to these different points. But it doesn't actually, it can't actually get to some of the regions of the map because it's not connected. So if I go back here and I change this to 40 so that it now has a slope of 40 degrees and I bake this, I'm now going to end up with a much better connected map that has all these different regions kind of connected. So this is one of the fiddles here that you go through when you're setting up a nav mesh on a terrain, is you want the regions to be connected, and an unconnected region is going to make it difficult for your character to navigate. So now I can click over here and it finds a path that goes around these little islands or little bumps and through that little narrow passageway and through that narrow passageway, and it gets to its target, and it goes where it is supposed to go. Now, if I were to click on a region that didn't have a nav mesh, so like this little mountain top here, it's going to go to as close as it can get to it, which turned out to be that edge over here. It's not at the destination that it was going to, but it's as close as it can get. And so with these terrains, we have to adjust the slope so that we get a connected nav mesh map. Otherwise, there'll be unreachable regions, and there are unreachable regions in here. Things like this little region way over here, it can't get onto that nav mesh because there's no connected region for it. So let me show you one other thing. Okay, I mentioned the static obstacles that are created with static objects in the baked nav mesh, the dynamic objects that may be moving that have a nav mesh obstacle component on them. And I mentioned that they should not be tagged nav mesh static, as they will move. With Pathfinder and Path by Mouse, we don't actually move the player, since all this is done by the NavMesh agent. The movement is controlled by the speed and angular speed and acceleration. But if we're going to do this with a character, things get a little more complicated. So I'll save that. Nope, not that one. This is just that same little character on this complicated terrain that I've got here. I have a fairly complex terrain with a lot of bumps and slopes on it, and my little character navigates in amongst the different bumps here. So it's finding its way through these canyons, avoiding obstacles and staying on the nav mesh and finding its way through these canyons to get to its ultimate target, which I believe is the little green cube here that it's trying to get to. Now, I wanted to do this with a mechanism character, with the dude, the little character that we played with a while ago. And so there is some fiddling that we have to do with this in order to make it work. I'm going to use the same idle chase jump controller that we used with the AI for idle chase jump, and with the dude mechanical controller, and I'm going to modify. Just take it easy there. We're going to modify the AI controller script a little bit that we developed for the chasing AIs. One thing I want to do is disable the can see function. And so all I've done is put a little if statement in here. If the see distance is ever 0, it's going to assume it can see. So it's going to return true. And the other thing I need to do is in the jump or idle functions, I want to turn off the nav mesh. And so I'm setting the agent is stopped to be true. This turns off the nav mesh agent, and it then can stand there and do its either jump or idle function without trying to seek out a target. So the modifications to the chasing AI include here, I've added a state chase. This is purely for debugging purposes. The state just shows in my inspector what the character is thinking about. And I've included in here, if the agent is stopped, that says that the agent is not active. I'm going to set is stopped to be false, which basically turns the agent back on again. And then I'm going to call a NavMesh agent function reset path, which means it recalculates where it's supposed to go. And in chase, the target position that I'm headed for is this target transform position plus that distance in front that I like to use so that it doesn't get right on top of my player. And I'm going to set the agent's destination to be this position. I'm also putting a little steering target out there, just a little physical object that I'm putting out in the world to kind of show visually where my AI is headed. And I'm putting it at the steering target's transform position. I'm putting it at the agent's steering target position. So the agent has a steering target that is the thing that it's aimed for. The steering target is not the ultimate destination. It's a point on one of the triangles that defines the path that the agent is following. When we look at our nav meshes are composed of triangles. We can see these different triangles. Sometimes they're long and skinny, but other times they're little, actually they're quadrilaterals, but we have the edge here, and the steering target will be on one of these edges. And as it moves along here, the steering target will move forward along each of those points. I'm not sure if we can see this here, but let's run it and see what happens. So can we see the steering targets? No, we can't see them. There they are. See the little white circles in front of the player here as it, in front of the agent as it's moving along. It's putting little white circles out at the edge of these different triangles that it's headed for. Now, I can actually use those to display the path that my agent's going to follow. You saw that path in the previous two examples of the click to move. There was a little line drawn that showed the path that my agent was trying to follow. And I do this with a path displayer script that is on an object that has a line renderer. And I'm going to manipulate that line with the path that the NavMesh agent is trying to follow. So this is a script somewhere in the world that is that displays my object. Here's the path display object, and it has this path displayer script on it. I've got an offset, which is how high above the world I want this line to manifest, and an interval. I have the line renderer and the NavMesh path and this vertical offset, and I cache a component of the line, and I start a coroutine, because I'm not going to do this every frame. I'm going to do this every once in a while. That interval is how often I'm going to recalculate this path, because this is fairly expensive. So in the while true loop of the updater, I'm fetching from the agent, the NavMesh agent, its path. And the path has corners. These are the spots along its path that are the steering targets that the character is going to head for. And I'm catching here the number of corners with the length. Path corners is an array. I set the positions. I define an array for the positions that's that size, because I'm going to catch those corners into that array of positions. And I'm then going to assign them, I'm going to add this little vertical offset so that they're higher up in the sky. I don't want them to be on the ground with the target. And then I set the line's position count to be the number of corners that I've got there. And I set the positions of the line's points to those positions. So this is going to show in my little map here the path that my character has, that my AI has, to get to its target. And so you can see over here in the lower left, you can see the path that the character is headed as it's trying to get to my player. And you can see in the lower right, the little steering targets that it's putting out as it's navigating those different edges on its way to meet up with me. And I'm here somewhere. Where's the little character? Here comes the little character. Now, because my character is following me, I can step down into this ditch, and the player now, or the AI now, has to calculate a new path because it can't step over that bump that I went. So it has to find another way around, and that other way around involves it backtracking, getting down into the ditch with me. There you can see one of the little steering targets, and it's headed for me. and I can chase my way through here, and the character will adjust its path. If I jump up onto the edge here, there it had to, because it can't step up over the edge, it has to find this long way around that's going to take it way far away from me, even though that's me right over there. And I don't want to step off the world. But if I step back into the ditch, it immediately comes and finds me. And there it got close enough, and so it turned off the NavMesh agent, and it started doing its little jump animation. And you can see what the AI can see there in the lower left hand. It can see the capsule that is me. So all that's pretty cool. And so now we have a NavMesh agent that is the idle run jump character. And everything's all set up to go. And I also have this same world here with a click to move here version. And so my little character is going to follow the click to move in this overhead view map. It's abysmal how long it takes it to load. So here's the little character. There's its little target. If I click over here in the map, it puts the little gold coin out in a different place, and it finds its way to me. And there's one of these samples where it can't get from here to there without going all the way around, and it got stuck there for a second. Got stuck. It's getting stuck. But it's finding its way around through the world to the different points that I'm specifying with my point and click here. And it's resetting the path pretty effectively. We're getting some lag, I think, because of Unity and Zoom not working well together. So I'm going to stop sharing there and entertain any questions about the NavMesh. And 20 people have typed something in chat. Let's see if there are any questions. Nope, just names, but we've got 15 people here and 20, some have left. Okay, so any questions about NavMesh?
How narrow can the NavMesh be, or for like the agent to pass over? Because I noticed like with the cube, sometimes it was much narrower.
It can be very narrow. What it's concerned with is the radius of the agent and how close it is to an obstacle. So if it's kind of a combination of that white area around the static obstacles,
okay,
the radius of the character. And what I've seen is that if the little blue region is connected, the agent can in general get in between it, unless of course the buffer area when you baked is too small, and it can't get through a gap that's a gap between objects that's smaller than the radius of the NavMesh agent, that cylinder that surrounds my agent. So if I were to take that and make that radius big, some of these paths would become unwalkable for it.
That makes sense.
It's a bunch of fiddling. A bunch of fiddling. And things to adjust are the speed of the character, the turning speed. If it can't turn fast enough, it can't navigate effectively. You saw with the ramp system, when it got up to the top of the ramp, it had to like bump itself around because it couldn't turn quickly enough to actually go straight up the ramp. It overshot, got behind the little white region that was there where the ramps overlapped funny, and then it had to kind of back around and go through it. So these things fiddle around. The important thing is the NavMesh agent is not following a straight path. It's not just deterministically going from one point to another. It's turning and navigating to get as close to this path as it can, but its turning is controlled by how fast you allow it to turn, and its speed is controlled by how rapidly you let it go. And the combination of those two, if it can't turn fast enough, you can have an agent that is kind of stupid. And if it turns too fast, then it doesn't look realistic. So, you know, it's all a balance of realism. And there are other settings. I didn't mention them, but there are other settings for how many computational cycles it throws at its navigation effort. So there's a quality setting for the navigation as well, and you can set it to high, medium, and low. I forget what the different settings are. All of this is fiddle. All of it has to do with balancing computation against performance. You know, if you throw too many cycles at something, you get lag. If you don't throw enough cycles at it, it doesn't behave well. So it's a trade-off. Any other questions? So given that Unity is working so poorly with my Zoom today, I'm not going to bother with the 3 minutes that I have left to show you, but I have one more little AI thing to show you before we go on to some other topics. And because the class is pretty much left, I'm going to do it with an announcement on Brightspace, but I talk about the demo day. So I'll be posting an announcement about demo day in the near future. Okay. Bye. I'm going to stop. Unless there are questions, I'm stopping recording. Any questions?